Hi, I'm Eilene Lyon, the author of Fortune's Frenzy, a California Gold Rush Odyssey. I would like to thank the Boulder Bookstore for hosting this Q&A. I'm a big supporter of independent bookstores, and though I live in Durango, I do contact the Boulder Bookstore when I need a gift card for my friends who live in that part of the state.
Can you give us a very brief synopsis of your book?
Though this book deals with the California Gold Rush, many of the issues covered were also relevant during the Colorado Gold Rush that took place a decade later. The protagonists of the book are Henry and Abigail Jenkins. They're about 50, and they're living in very poor circumstances in a pioneer community in eastern Indiana, though they were raised and educated in Philadelphia. Henry decides that California gold is going to be the answer to all his financial troubles. So he bands together with a group of younger men who were also married with children to go to California. In order to get there, they had to borrow a large sum of money from a wealthy merchant. The book covers their travels and what happens to them in California, as well as what's going on with their family back in Indiana. And then they had to deal with paying back the merchant once they got home.
What were some surprising things you learned while putting this book together?
Well, not surprisingly, a book about the California Gold Rush is partly about money. So I had to do a lot of research about early monetary policy and the history of money in the United States. And that's when I learned about Alexander Hamilton's U.S. Bank and Andrew Jackson's closing of the bank in 1828. By the mid-19th century, there was no such thing as actual physical U.S. money. No dollar bills, no quarters, dimes, nickels, pennies. That stuff didn't exist. Paper money was issued by state banks, and every state bank's money was worth a different amount. There was no uniformity. If you lived in the continent interior, if you were living in a pioneer community, you didn't generally have access to paper money. There weren't any banks in your community. There were some coins floating around, some silver coins from Mexico, sometimes gold coins from Germany. But for the most part, these people had to make do without cash. So they lived in a largely cashless economy. And it wasn't a bartering system that they used. So I had covered that in the book. Now, the second item that I thought was interesting really doesn't have anything to do with the plot of the book, but it just surprised me. Now, I knew that Sears sold kit homes in the early 20th century, but it turns out that prefabricated houses were a thing in the 1850s as well. And there's a guy in the book who imports a couple dozen houses that were pre-manufactured in Philadelphia, shipped around the Horn of South America, and constructed in Santa Clara, California. And these were beautiful homes, and they were built without the use of nails. Very interesting. One of the other things I had to research quite a bit, because the Blackford Mining Company went down the Ohio and Mississippi rivers from Cincinnati to New Orleans before they went to Panama to cross the isthmus. And so I studied Western steamboats. And somebody told me about the Steamboat Arabia Museum in Kansas City. They resurrected a boat that sank in the Missouri River mud in 1856. And they found the hold full of pristine goods. You could even eat the preserved food that was sealed in jars. And this museum, it's like the Walmart of 1856. If you ever were curious about what people could buy in a store at that time, it's quite fascinating.
What were some of the unexpected hardships these miners faced in their quest for gold?
Something you might not consider is the fact that California really didn't have much development at the time of the gold rush. And these guys had a hard time getting enough quality and quantity of food. There was no infrastructure to supply them, and they had to rely on imported goods, and a lot of it was spoiled. So it was very difficult, and these guys had to get a lot of calories because they're doing very hard work. Even if they knew to forage for certain fruits and things at home back east, they didn't know the California flora. So it was very difficult for them to get enough food. Another hardship for the particular guys that I'm writing about was that they formed a company called the Blackford Mining Company. And the idea was that they would work together and share their expenses and their profits. But the reality of gold mining is that it's a very unequal enterprise. You know, the equal amount of work does not necessarily come out with equal rewards. So some of the guys might find a lot of gold and some might find none. And after a while, the ones who were finding gold would resent sharing it with the ones who were not, even if they were all working equally as hard. So that caused a lot of friction between the guys in this mining company.
Would you read us a short passage from your book?
I'd be happy to. A number of readers have told me that they really enjoy the section of the book about the crossing of the isthmus at Panama. They arrived at the port of Chagres, and then they had to go up the Chagres River and cross about 26 miles overland to reach Panama City. So this is a brief excerpt from that section. On shore, the Blackford Company confronted the various options for getting upriver. At first, they planned to take a small steamboat for $8 apiece, but then opted once again for frugality. In bungos, for the budget fare of $6, it would take them 3 days instead of 1 to reach Gorgona. Natives propelled the 20-foot-long covered boats with oars and poles. According to Pete, they were large, dark-skinned fellows with on only an apron tied around them. Before boarding a bungo with a few of his companions, Henry found an agent to get his latest letter onto the mail packet ship. The one-way conversation propelled his imagination. What was happening at home? How was Abby managing without him? Was Bedford following his instructions about the farm work to be done this month? He could ask all the questions in the world, but who knew if he would ever get answers? They started upstream the same afternoon they arrived in port, managing the 6 miles to Gatun. Nothing like the gargantuan drainages that had taken them to New Orleans, the Chagres was only about 300 yards wide and hemmed in by monolithic jungle. Vines snaked around trees, binding them together into a solid mass of day-glow green, topping out above the canopy and wearing blossoming bonnets of scarlet and magenta. In places, the draping branches of the understory dipped into the murky olive-brown water, like the outstretched necks of watering horses. Colorful butterflies floated about, and exotic avian species splashed rainbow hues against the jade foliage. White-shouldered vultures lurked in the canopy, and herons waded in shallows near the banks. They camped at Gatun for the night, some on shore and some at the bottom of the boats. Before daylight, we were awoke by the howling of wild beasts on every side, but what they were we could not find out. As the men on the boat, we could not talk to them nor them to us. We thought some were wolves. They howled very like them. Another kind, much louder, we were informed, were a small kind of lion, and another kind, large monkeys. Henry later observed primates, both large and small, multi-hued parrots, and a few alligators. The unsuspecting Panamanian fauna were frequent targets of bored Americans with guns and ammo to spare, much as the Caribbean sharks had been. They started at first light and pulled into shore a couple hours later to make coffee and eat, doing the same at midday. Coffee could be had from the natives, but one traveler chose to go without when he discovered they had run out of sugar. Wondering what the serving girl would do about it, he followed her and watched as she got a piece of sugar cane and commenced chewing it, and occasionally she would eject the juice from her mouth into the coffee while it was being prepared outside the hut. And by the way, here's an illustration of one of the bungos at Gatun. There are 43 illustrations in this book from the period. I hope you will enjoy reading Fortune's Frenzy.